Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. Today, interfaith and interreligious relationships and households are on the rise in the United States. The public perception of interreligious marriage has greatly shifted over time, from the 1950s and 60s, when the practice was actually quite taboo, to today, when such relationships are rising dramatically. American popular entertainment and culture, from Little House on the Prairie, The Heartbreak Kid, Annie Hall, Bridget Loves Bernie, Sex and the City, and The O.C., has depicted a range of interfaith and interreligious relationships. Books have been written on how to have an interfaith Jewish and Christian celebration known as Chrismukkah, and religious life has begun to intertwine families and generations across religious lines. Combining faiths within households and the multicultural shifts that occur from those marriages is the topic of today's discussion with my guest, Dr. Samira Mehta. Dr. Samira Mehta is a scholar of religion and the politics of the American family and an assistant professor of women and gender studies and Jewish studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. She has a degree in divinity from Harvard University and a PhD from Emory University. The topic of this conversation is her book, Beyond Chrismukkah, Christian, Jewish, Interfaith Families in the United States, released from Chapel Hill University of North Carolina Press in 2018. I hope you enjoy this conversation just in time for the 2019 holiday season. So without further delay, please enjoy this chat with Dr. Samira Mehta. Dr. Mehta, thank you so much for coming on Classical Ideas.
Thank you for having me.
Can you just maybe spend a moment and introduce yourself to the audience and tell everybody what you do?
So I focus on sort of family religious practices and representations and thoughts about the American family from about World War II to the present. I work in Jewish studies, American religion, and women and gender studies in terms of disciplines. So I'm really interested in thinking about the intersections of those worlds and how they play out in family life.
Wonderful. How did the scholarly exploration of religion enter your life? What kind of hooked you into making this a profession?
So when I was in college, I had to fill a distribution requirement. I was an English major, and I was at a school that said you had to take 3 classes in the humanities, 3 in the social sciences, 3 in the natural sciences, and you had to cover at least 2 departments. So I needed to take a class outside of the English department. And I decided to try a Patterns of Asian Religion class. I'm half Indian. I wanted someone to explain Hinduism to me.
Nice.
And I just loved the religion department. They were fantastic people. I ended up double majoring. Mostly out of love of them. And then when I was applying to PhD programs in English, I realized that it would make me really sad to stop studying religion. And at the time anyway, and I have not kept up with what's going on in the world of English literature, but at the time, there wasn't a lot of room to do religion and literature, at least through English programs. And so I ended up deciding to study religion instead. I did this experiment on myself. I took an extra year off between college and graduate school. And as I was like, oh my God, I can't go to graduate school in English. I want to study religion. What am I going to do? So I went to the Harvard bookstore, which is this amazing independent bookstore in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I bought a bunch of 19th century British novels, a bunch of literary theory, a bunch of American religious history, and a bunch of early Christianity. Those were the 4 things that I really loved. And decided that when it was time to make a decision about graduate school, I'd see what I had read. And I had read all of the 19th century British novels and all of the American religious history, but none of the literary theory and none of the early Christianity. And I was sort of like, well, I think that's an answer. I think the scholarly work that I'm interested in is American religious history. And then from there, I came to get very involved in the study of American Judaism.
Very cool. That is such a neat little experiment you ran on yourself. I love that. So
extremely dorky 23-year-old.
Yeah, no, but it's actually really cool. And, I see a lot of that in myself looking back at that age as well, where I wanted to explore new things, new ideas, new cultures, and I wound up doing a lot of traveling. But, I feel like that is such a transformative moment. So you have this new book out called Beyond Chrismukkah, and the theme in the book is about interfaith families. And interfaith is like a growing trend on this show in particular. Like, I've done episodes specifically on interfaith activism, and I've talked to people who have interfaith backgrounds, and it seems that it's super common in this country and only getting more and more common. So how did you latch on to the prevalence of interfaith as a possible area of academic pursuit?
So I really didn't, is in some ways my answer. I was looking for a topic, and this book was originally my dissertation. And so it's a very long germination project. And so when I came up with this topic, interfaith wasn't holding the space that it's holding right now.
Yeah.
So I went to graduate school wanting to work on the Puritans. I think my advisor just trusted that I would outgrow that. I got to Emory and I discovered that I didn't love the Puritans. I had loved the professor who taught the Puritans.
Right.
In my master's program, who is brilliant and funny and snarky and grandfatherly. Like, he was a wonderful professor for me. But without him, I wasn't as interested in the Puritans anymore. But what I was, and so I had this professor at Emory named Diane Stewart, and she said, well, what about them excited you? And we talked, and we realized that what I was interested in was this phenomenon that happens both in Puritan New England and with interfaith families. What happens when the religious rules of an institution do not match what the believers need and want, right? So you want things, you like, the rules just don't fit with you and who you are and what you want, but you're not willing to walk out on the religion because there are still things that really matter to you. Mm-hmm. So I've got a really good friend who wants to be a priest, but she also wants to be a daily communicant. And it's really hard to find that in the Episcopal Church. And so, like, she's like, do I walk on Catholicism so that I can be a priest? Or do I stay a Catholic because I want this ritual practice, right? I suspect she could find it in the Episcopal Church, but it would be harder, right? Mm-hmm. And so, like, what do you do with that? How do people navigate that tension between the rules of their institutions and the cultures and conventions of their institutions, and the fact that their own lives, needs, wants, beliefs, spiritual journeys, ethics, whatever, don't fit, but there's still something that they're really looking for from that institution, a worldview, a sense of wonder, a sense of history, a sense of community, all sorts of things. And so I was trying to figure out another way to study that kind of tension. And I went out to lunch with my friend, who was a student priest at the big Episcopal church near where we went to graduate school. And he had just had a student come to him for sort of private confirmation tutoring, because the student's family wasn't super involved in the church and didn't have a ton of background, and he hadn't, like, done the Sunday school that he needed to get confirmed. But they wanted him to get confirmed. And the kid revealed that he had had a bar mitzvah. Mm. And so my friend is out to lunch with me, and I'm looking for a topic, and he is looking for anything that he can read that will explain to him what on earth is going on in the life of this family, because he's trying to figure out how to respond to them. And he's not necessarily, and he's worried about all sorts of things, right? Like, the rabbi who did the bar mitzvah is someone that he and the priest who is his supervisor have lunch with at, like, Atlanta clergy lunch once a month or whatever. And he's trying to figure out, like, how to navigate that, but also, like, what are the actual needs of the family? And what he finds is that everything that has been written about interfaith families is either a how-to manual, or, in which case it's prescriptive, right?
Right.
It's saying, like, here is how to pick one religion, and it should be X.
Right.
Or here's how to do both. Although very few of those in 2005 when we're having this 2006 when we're having this conversation. Or it's a piece of sociological work, usually out of Jewish studies, and usually privileging, sort of often pathologizing interfaith families, like, what's wrong with these people, suggesting that the Jewish partner doesn't really have a strong Jewish identity. Maybe they're a self-hating anti-Semite. And none of it's overtly saying any of this, but that's all part of the, like, subtext to what's going on.
Interesting. Okay, so now that you've done all this work, how do you, like, define interfaith marriage? Like, are there specific things that is there a specific way we can define this in 2019? This trend, this phenomenon in society?
Well, so the way that it is defined, I think this is the definition that the Pew, like, religion and public life folks use, but it's certainly the definition that gets used in Putnam and Campbell's American Grace.
Mm-hmm.
Is they basically say an interfaith marriage is a marriage between anyone in a given collection of groups. So, and the groups are mainline Protestants, evangelical Protestants, Catholics, possibly Orthodox. I think Orthodox Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism. I'm probably missing somebody. And like, you know, that's not a bad understanding for the United States.
Right.
You could make an argument that, you know, if you're going to say mainline Protestantism and evangelical Protestantism is interfaith, or if you're going to say, like, if you are UCC and you are marrying somebody who is a sort of not particularly devout Catholic, right? Like, you're sort of both lightly Christian, but you're not, right? In that case, if that's an interfaith marriage, shouldn't a Reformed Jew and an Orthodox Jew be an interfaith marriage?
That is super interesting.
Shouldn't, like, I have a friend who is Sunni.
Right.
And, like, met this guy, and the guy was awesome, and she really, like, was excited to date the guy. Like, not to marry him, to, like, go out on a date with him. But he was Ismaili, and he wouldn't, like, they could be friends, but they couldn't date because he was Ismaili. She's now married to a Reformed Jew. So, you know, there are so the thing about the definitions that get used in the United States is that we nuance Christianity a lot more. So we're like, all right, we're not counting people within the main line. So if, let's leave the Methodists out of this, because who knows where the Methodists are going to be in 3 months. But, like, if a member of the Presbyterian Church USA marries a member of the United Church of Christ, we're not calling that an interfaith marriage. But
okay.
If a member of the Presbyterian Church USA marries a member of the Presbyterian Church of America, that's an interfaith marriage because one person is mainline and the other is evangelical. Like, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But then you need to say that my cousin's marriage, and our family is Arya Samaj. My dad's side of the family is largely Arya Samaj. She married somebody who is definitely not Arya Samaj. This is proof that I'm not a Hinduism scholar. I can't remember what her husband is. But, like, it's a similarly huge gap in the world of Hinduism. Now, I imagine if you're studying religion in contemporary India, you'd have a way of capturing that. But in the United States, all of those people are Hindu. But, like, the space gap is every single bit as big as between a, like, liberal lefty Birkenstock wearing Quaker and a Southern Baptist with, like, nylons on even in August, right?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Okay, and the book, because I was reading this book and I was blown away because I thought about my own grandparents who went to different churches for my entire life, and like lightning bolts were going off, like thinking about my own life and how many people I had known whose families had gone to two different churches forever, but you just never think about it like that. So I'm curious about the research process. So Beyond Chrismukkah, the Christian-Jewish interfaith family in the United States, from the University of North Carolina Press. Tell me about the research that you did, because there are these fantastic and phenomenal and wide-ranging anecdotes in this book that are so many studies wrapped up into one. Tell me about this huge process you went through.
So it took years.
Yeah.
And a lot of archives. I spent a lot of time in Cincinnati at the American Jewish Archives, a full month there. I spent time at in DC, big basilica, really, really, really tiny, dingy reading room. Is it just Catholic University?
Yeah, Catholic University, and there's also the American Cathedral.
Catholic University. So in the Catholic University archives, I spent time in the Notre Dame archives. I decided, I was like trying to figure out how to like treat Protestantism. So I ended up reading every single thing that the Christian Century published about interfaith marriage ever in its entire history. Because Christian Century is sort of the it is the magazine, the sort of shared magazine of the Protestant main line. And I thought about the amount of time that I put into Catholic archives and Jewish archives, and I imagined trying to scale that to all of the Protestant denominations, and decided to use the Christian Century. So I did that. I wanted institutional takes on things. I didn't end up including this in the book, but I imagine that someday I could potentially write an article thinking about Catholic Protestant interfaith marriage before Vatican II.
Yes, that would be interesting.
And the reason I didn't end up writing about it is that I basically started my book project in about 1965. So I end up starting my project right after Vatican II. But Vatican II turns out to radically change the dynamic around Catholic Protestant marriage, because it decreases some of the lived practice differences between Catholics and Protestants. But in like the 1930s and 40s, there's a lot of anxiety about Catholic Protestant marriage that I never ended up writing about, but I've got all of these stories. It's like people being like, oh my God, if he's Protestant and she doesn't want to cook meat on Friday, will he let her cook fish on Friday? Will he demean her if she doesn't? Like, will he insist on a pot roast, and will he like insist that the kids eat the pot roast? And oh my God, or if she's Protestant and he's Catholic, will he just come home and there's like roast chicken on the table, right? What's going to happen? And so like all of that is at Notre Dame. And it's really great. And even though it didn't end up in the book, those debates really helped me think about some of what is going on, or some of what could be going on. And honestly, a lot of those are not things that are going on in the early, like I end up writing about. So I write institutionally about Catholics, Protestants, and Jews, and then I write about popular culture. And what you see is that the Catholic-Protestant distinction just drops out of the debate. It becomes Christians and Jews, and it doesn't even matter what kind of Christian you're dealing with. And this is super interesting, because in American religious history, Catholics and Jews are sort of the outsider, the big important outsider traditions in sort of, I'm not saying this is the best way to do American religious history, but sort of functionally the way that we do American religious history is to present them as like the, you know, you've got like this 1950s Tri-Faith America model, and we kind of backform that. And so they're the important minority voices in the American story.
Gotcha. Okay, so you mentioned an important date, 65, 66. I want to talk about that. There's something that happens in 1966 called the General Commission on Chaplains and Armed Forces Personnel, and they write about the official, quote-unquote, official stances of interfaith marriage. So in the early days, there is like no like active process by Jewish and Christian religious leaders to like discourage interfaith marriage, and later on then they like reluctantly seem to accept it if there's nothing they can do to stop it. So I found myself captivated by the use of language that you use in the book. And you say things like minimize the damage and battle and threat. So I want you to tell listeners about how to understand the context of this rapid rise of interfaith in the 60s through the 80s while keeping in mind like those violent sounding keywords.
So the first thing that I would say is that I had no idea that there were violent sounding keywords until I read the question that you wrote for me.
Nice.
Like, I had no idea. I was just sort of, and I think that part of it is actually that chapter, I structure it, right, around this military document.
Yeah.
And so I wonder whether it's a little bit just that the military is into military sounding metaphors.
Sure.
That's a possibility. I will say that Protestants less so. Protestants are really worried about threats to marriage, but they're not worried about threats to Protestantism. The Protestant mainline has not yet figured out that it's going to be demographically absolutely screwed in 50 years. Mm-hmm. They don't see that one coming yet. Jews, however, are super worried about continuity and threats to the survival of Judaism, and that makes a lot of sense, right? This is the 1960s. There isn't an adult Jew alive who doesn't probably actively remember genocide, right? Like, and stories of genocide. These are not people who were raised to know about the Holocaust. There are young adult Jews who like grew up with the awareness of the Holocaust, right? Like, because they were babies. But any adult decision-making kind of Jew is, was an adult or a teenager at least, for the Holocaust. So Jews are very aware. Jewish life fundamentally is altered forever by the Holocaust, right? European Jewish communities are decimated. 6 million Jews die. The psychological damage borne by the community is huge. And people are really worried that interfaith marriage poses as big a threat to Jewish continuity as did the Holocaust. In fact, as you see in later chapters, when I talk about the response to, for instance, the television show Bridget Loves Bernie, I did not realize that there were all of these battle metaphors going on, or that I was using them, but I certainly was aware of the Holocaust metaphors, right? People talk about this television show, Bridget Loves Bernie, which is a sitcom about the hijinks of an interfaith Catholic Jewish couple. And people write into the New York Times saying it's as if CBS made a sitcom about the merry adventures of a family on their way to the gas chambers. That is not quite a direct quote because I didn't write it down to look at for my notes, but it is a pretty close paraphrase. It's a letter to the editor, a letter to the New York Times. People are really concerned, and people say things like, it would be ironic if American acceptance of Jews finished Hitler's work for him. So people are really worried that interfaith marriage is going to be the end of American Judaism and therefore the end of Judaism. The Catholic Church, I think, is in this moment of really heightened change and is also feeling fairly besieged by youth culture, right? Like, this is also the 1960s. People are walking out on institutional Christianity, both Protestant and Catholic, and on institutional Judaism. And so they're feeling those threats and numerical hits as well.
So now can we talk a little bit about Vatican II? Why does Vatican II matter in the history of interfaith marriage? So
I think that part of the reason that for the second half of the century, interfaith families ends up being a Christian Jewish story instead of a Protestant Catholic story or a Protestant Catholic Jewish story, but really like a Christian Jewish story. I mean, it's partly that many of the people that I'm talking about are really kind of post-institutional in a lot of ways. They're religious seekers and sort of the, maybe they grew up in a church or a synagogue and it's the 1960s and they tuned in and they dropped out, or at the very least they walked out. They're upset about sexism. They're upset about social complicity around Vietnam, around race, whatever it is. They're just like not as into it, right? Like it's no longer socially necessary to go. All sorts of things happen. And so partly Protestant and Catholic stopped mattering quite as much because you're talking about Christmas trees. You're not talking about what you're doing on Sunday morning. But partly Vatican II does. Earlier, I was talking about like all of this anxiety about like, oh my God, what if she won't cook fish on Friday? What if he makes her cook meat on Friday? Those tensions go away, right? Vatican II reduces a lot of the difference between Protestants and Catholics in terms of how it is that they're living in the world.
Oh.
Not necessarily in terms of liturgy or embodiment. I think there are still really distinctive cultural things about Catholic and Protestant life. I don't mean to say that there aren't, but a lot of the sort of institutional anxiety goes away. And I think that that's very important. I also think that less Vatican II and more in 1970, the Vatican releases a statement called Matrimonia Mixta. I don't speak Latin. Mm-hmm. I mean, please don't tell my junior high school Latin teacher don't speak Latin, and I also just like, so I don't know the word and I can't remember. Matrimonia Mixta, I think, or Mixa. And it's 1970. And basically it is the Catholic Church saying, we will marry anybody provided they do X, Y, and Z. Like, we would prefer that you marry a Catholic. Your marriage is not going to be sacramental in the same way if you do not marry a Catholic. This is the deal, right? But, and if you're not going to marry a Catholic, we would prefer that you marry a baptized person. But we actually get that we can't stop you from marrying an unbaptized person, and you can get married, and you can get married in a Catholic church by a Catholic priest, as long as you promise to raise your kids as Catholics. And so initially, the non-Catholic has to agree to help raise the kids as Catholics. Now, the non-Catholic just has to agree to not get in the way.
Interesting. So, and then in 1966, there was a document from Paul VI called the Apostolic Letter Motu Proprio, determining the norms for mixed marriage. Is that kind of like saying the same stuff that you're talking about right now?
So honestly, I don't remember, and meant to look it up because you asked me about it ahead of time and didn't. And the reason that I don't remember is that because it's around for 4 years, and then it's sort of superseded by what I'm talking about from 1970.
Gotcha. Okay.
But it's essentially, it's the same, it's moving in the same direction. It's sort of outlining, like, look, here are the problems with mixed marriage, or with interfaith marriage. In order for marriage to be a sacrament, both people need to be in a state of grace when they enter the marriage. If you're Catholic, we've got a procedure. Mm-hmm. Right? And it is, you go to confession, you do your reconciliation, you're good to go, right? Protestants don't do this, and so you've got no way of knowing whether or not Protestants are in a state of grace, and probably think they're not, because they probably have committed sins, right? So what you've got is this problem in which you can't have marriage is not a sacrament under those circumstances, right? And so they're concerned about that, and they're outlining those concerns. And the church is pretty clear that they don't want you to do this. But in the end, maybe the 1970, you could say it's a little bit of a loosening of the rules. It's fine, but here's the deal.
So, and you said something earlier about the kids, and this is something that I was really interested about, because throughout the book, it seems to me that it's not like the actual people who are getting married to each other that are most important to religious leaders. It seems to be all about the kids. Does this seem to be accurate as well?
I think so. It's a little bit hard for me to say whether or not that's like my bias shaping the project.
And I think the same thing about myself as well.
Like, I think pretty strongly, and I felt that my research bore this out, two people can kind of make anything work as long as they're not trying to like shape the like mental worlds of children.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you can go to synagogue with me and I can go to church with you and we can explore and experiment and enjoy those things. But if we're being told that it's going to be really bad for our kids to do both, and if we're being told that our kids can't be both, which people are being told by religious leaders and sort of by, there's the sort of, this is no longer the case. But like certainly in the 1970s and in the 1980s, conventional wisdom is saying you have to pick one religion for the kids. And that's where you start getting problems. And because how do you determine it? How do you figure it out? Or you get people who, until they have kids, they're, like I said, they're secular Jews, they're lapsed Catholics, they're post-Protestant. They're going home for Christmas, right? And like, I don't know, I at one point had a boyfriend who was like, let's get a Christmas tree. And I was like, we're going to be at my parents' house for 2 weeks. We cannot get a Christmas tree. It will burn down the house. Like, we're not hiring somebody to come over and water the tree every day so the house doesn't burn down, right? And so, like, you can't... So people are going away. You have kids, you're more likely to be in your own house for the holiday. Oh my God, are we getting a tree? There's a television show, 30-something. It was an Emmy award-winning show in the late 80s. And the husband talks about how before he had a kid, he used to love celebrating Christmas with his wife. He liked all of it. He liked it in their house. He liked it at her parents' house. It was lovely. It was fun. And now that he's got a kid, he sees his grandfather rising up from the grave to have another heart attack at the idea that this little Jewish kid is celebrating Christmas. Now, interestingly, according to Jewish law, kid's not Jewish, mom's not Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and they're not giving the kid a Jewish education. So by the standards of conservative and Orthodox Judaism, kid isn't Jewish, mom's not Jewish. By the standards of Reform Judaism, I guess kid is too young to have had a Jewish education yet. But, like, they don't show any inclination to be giving the kid a Jewish education. He's not Jewish. But he's like, he had loved having a tree as long as he was a person with a Jewish identity participating in this fun celebration as the Jewish guest. But how do you give your kid a strong Jewish identity if they're growing up with a tree? Are they going to know that they're supposed to feel like a guest who's having fun? And
interesting.
And I think it happens in the other direction, too. I talked to one person who unfortunately lost a kid, and they had agreed to have the kid be Jewish. And as the child was dying of leukemia, the Christian father, who had not cared that the kid wasn't getting baptized, who didn't think he believed in baptism, all of a sudden, when it became really clear that the kid was going to die, started having nightmares about the fact that the kid hadn't been baptized, and he didn't believe that baptism did anything. And he didn't feel the need to force baptism on his Jewish wife, but, like, he was responsible for the fact that his kid wasn't baptized. And what if he turned out to be wrong, right? What if his mother, his grandmother, his childhood minister, what if they were all right?
Right, it's like Pascal's wager.
And he couldn't do it. And his Jewish wife said, absolutely, bring in... I don't remember what kind of Christian he was. Bring in a priest, bring in a minister, bring in the hospital chaplain. Let's get this kid baptized. And she, like, from her standpoint, whatever. It's not efficacious.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't matter. And she ended up leaving Judaism. She got such flack from her rabbi for having allowed her husband to baptize their child that she walked on Judaism.
Oh, it's so intense. Okay, let's talk about something lighthearted for a second. Let's talk about TV shows and movies.
Well, I was going to say Christmas cookies made into dreidels, but okay,
That's
shows.
Spectacular. So, like, one of my favorite portions of the book is your exploration and the depictions of film and television shows that depict interfaith marriage, and this seemed like you probably had a lot of fun doing research on Little House on the Prairie, Abby's Irish Rose, The Heartbreak Kid, Annie Hall, Bridget Loves Bernie, Sex and the City, and The O.C., which, fun fact, provides the origin story for the title of the book. and the classic The Way We Were. How much fun was this movie and TV show and pop culture research section?
So my sort of work husband likes to refer to me as the foremost scholar on the OC who's never watched the OC. Which is not true in that I have seen the Chrismukkah episodes.
Yeah.
But I've only seen the Chrismukkah episodes. I don't like the OC. I really enjoyed, I went to the Paley Center for Media in New York because at the time that was the only place I could see Bridget Loves Bernie. Now, I own the DVDs. You can sometimes find clips online and sometimes not, depending on, I don't know, what determines what's on the internet. But at the time, I went to the Paley Center for Media. The Paley Center for Media is a place where you can do research, but it's basically a TV museum. And so it turns out that if you show up and you present yourself as somebody actually doing research, the staff gets so overwhelmingly excited that I just sat there watching every single episode of the one season of Bridget Loves Bernie, and they would come and interrupt me with stuff that I hadn't thought of because they were so excited to have an actual researcher on site. And so, Rhoda, the Mary Tyler Moore show, Rhoda the Jewish Friend, Rhoda gets her own television show in which she marries somebody Catholic. This is particularly funny because both neither Val Harper nor the woman who plays her mother, Ida Morgan's, what's Ida's last? I don't remember Rhoda's last name. Both of those actresses neither of them are Jewish. So anyway, point is, they just bring me stuff. They would think things. There was a television show called, Chicken Soup or something like that. It was terrible. It was about an interfaith marriage. And so that was really fun. And I just sort of spent a month hanging out at the Paley Center for Media.
Sweet.
Watching TV and knitting a lot. And it was very slow because I was transcribing stuff. So, I would be just sitting there watching TV and knitting, and then I would hit, a 10-minute scene that I needed, and it would take me 2 hours to get all of it down.
Yeah.
I added the parts on The Way We Were and Annie Hall later. Those aren't in my dissertation at all. There are some things that didn't make it in. I watched I don't even know how many seasons worth of Mad About You, waiting for them to cop to the fact that it was an interfaith marriage. If you Google television interfaith marriage, Mad About You comes up. If you spend 3 minutes watching Mad About You, you can tell it's an interfaith marriage. They never admit to it.
Interesting.
The closest they come is they have a fight about oyster stuffing on a Thanksgiving episode.
Oh my gosh.
Which Helen Hunt's family has oyster stuffing, and what's his face? Her husband's family.
Is it Paul Reiser?
Yes. Paul Reiser's family doesn't. And I am from such a non-oyster stuffing family that it took me a while to even figure out that was maybe my hint, because I was thinking we were talking about oyster mushrooms for the entire thing.
Yeah.
And so, you can tell that they're an interfaith couple, but the show never says anything. And I didn't end up, I wish if I could, I guess I should have gone back and put this in the book maybe. I wish I had added something talking about that. But in the end, it just sort of also fell outside of the periodization. I don't talk about 30-something very much either. Because what I was really trying to do with that chapter, in contrast to the institutional chapter, it's the same time frame. And I was really trying to say, all three of these major religious groupings institutionally are don't do it, no interfaith marriage. And television was and movies were this is great. This is how you become a real American. You can get out of your ethnic ghetto and stop being too immigrant-y. And you don't need to eschew bacon, and you don't need to drape things with icons of saints. You too can be a good, secular, sort of Protestant American, right?
Yeah.
And so that was where I was going. And so in the end, Mad About You is from the 90s and 30-something is from the late 80s. And I had sort of moved on to other topics by those time periods.
Something that's a really modern example that I think a ton of listeners will latch onto is your depictions of Sex in the City. And I had some questions about the gender depiction.
It turns out that Sex in the City is not a contemporary example.
Oh, it's not?
No, I was recently informed by a student that Sex and the City is mom TV.
Oh, goodness. Okay, well, to all the moms out there, I have seen the Sex and the City movies, by the way. So, speaking of Sex and the City, your depiction of one character's conversion to Judaism shows her, like, giving it her all as far as, like, being Jewish. She goes all in after conversion to Judaism. And it shows her, like, giving it her all, being Jewish, after marrying a Jewish man. And
no, in order to marry the Jewish man.
In order to marry the Jewish man, right.
She's not Jewish.
So she's, like, super serious about it after her conversion and marriage, but he seems to be not serious. So he had her convert so he could marry her. But now she seems to like it, whereas he wants, like, little to do with actually doing a Jewish household. So I'm curious about, like, the gender discussion within this question. Is this fairly common in real life where a wife will convert, works really hard to learn a lot so she can legitimately raise Jewish or Christian children, and then she, like, outperforms the Jewishness or Christianness of the husband so much that he, like, gets resentful at her seriousness?
So this is something that I saw a decent amount of. A really good place to look for more about this is Jennifer Thompson's book, Jewish on Their Own Terms. So I just want to give a shout out. Really, I talk about this less than I might because she did such a spectacular job that, like, there just wasn't any need. And she did really amazing deep ethnography with I don't remember now whether she talks to women who have converted, but to Christian women who have signed up to raise Jewish kids. So one of the ways that people talk about this is the difference between being Jewish and doing Jewish.
Yeah.
So a lot of the time, particularly, like, the people who get into interfaith marriages, right? The Jews are often, they're cultural Jews, they're secular Jews. They were maybe raised in synagogue and they maybe envision themselves raising kids in synagogues, but they don't. So you get these sort of people for whom a cultural Jewish identity is very important. And maybe they were always sort of assuming that they would force their kids to go to Hebrew school and have a bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah. But it's not like they're not massively religious people. And then two things end up happening. If they marry somebody who is Christian, and in marrying somebody Christian, they're asking her to give up Christianity. And let's be really clear, right? Like, I study a lot of people who are in the doing both camp, and this is not what's going on. But if you're talking about people who are committing to be Jewish, maybe they're asking her to give up church and a church community. And the thing is that, like, maybe she didn't seem wicked crazy Christian, right? Like, she goes to church on Sunday mornings some of the time, but, like, you know, you don't really care. You're having a lazy morning. You're watching Meet the Press. You're doing the laundry. At least that's what my father always did on Sunday mornings. Laundry, Meet the Press. And she's gone for like an hour, right? Synagogue takes 3 hours. Church takes an hour. You're in, you're out. You drink some coffee, you're done. Or if you're Catholic, you're in, you're out, you don't drink coffee, you're done. This is what Protestants think is weirdest about Catholicism, is how often there isn't a happy hour. And, you know, like, that's, and so it doesn't seem like a big deal, and then she's giving it up. Or maybe she's just being asked to give up Christmas. She's not even being asked to give up church community, but it turns out that Christmas and its rituals are filling a really important need for her. And so she agrees to be Jewish, but it turns out that what makes you a good or a bad Jew in the minds and lives of most American Jews is not actually whether or not you go to synagogue. There are lots of other markers of Jewish identity as, like, an important American minority identity. And, like, what they are depends a little bit on your generation. It might be going to synagogue. It might be really encyclopedic knowledge of Woody Allen. That is less true for people my age who, like, watched him sleep with his own kid. Oh. But, like, you know, I mean, I guess she was his stepkid. But out of due respect to Andre Previn of blessed memory, right, who was her father. But But like maybe Woody Allen a little bit less for my generation. But there's Jewish humor, it's engagement with Jewish humor, it's maybe engagement with Jewish foodways. There are lots of things that mark Jewish identity. And but when somebody is sort of giving up Christianity, they're maybe giving up a sense of community, and they're going to want to replace that. They're going to want to go to synagogue. The other possibility is like you can't really convert to an ethnic identity, right? Like you can't become nothing. I could take classes at the local Catholic church and I could like become a believer, and I could believe in Jesus, and I could believe in saints, and I could, pray the rosary, and it's not going to turn me into an Italian, right? And the thing is that we understand that because we've got Catholicism over here and we've got Italian over here. That's not how Judaism works.
Yeah.
Right? Someone is going to say, I can't marry you because you're not Jewish. And they mean, I can't marry you because you're not Italian. But the only way to get into Jewish is through Catholic. So, like, the only way that Charlotte can become Jewish is to become religiously Jewish.
Yeah.
And yes, she can learn to make matzo ball soup. She can learn how to make and braid challah. She can learn all sorts of things. But if she starts cussing in Yiddish, and she's living in New York, so that's okay. All of New York cusses in Yiddish. The one non-Jew on my dissertation committee is a Christian theologian and a Presbyterian, but because she was born on the Upper West Side, I couldn't get it through my head that she wasn't Jewish. And in the end, it never mattered because I never came up with a reference that she didn't already know because she's from the Upper West Side, right? So maybe in Charlotte's case, she could be fetchy in Yiddish. But if you're not, is that an affectation, right? If you didn't grow up using Yiddish, is it an affectation when you start, right? Like you kind of can't do those things. And you can, as I said, you can learn to make matzo ball soup. You can learn how to make simmis. You can learn how to make hummus. You can learn how to do whatever. You're not going to materialize a grandmother's recipe for those.
Right.
Right? And so, the only way in is through religion. And so if you're trying to do it, you're doing it through religion. And, one of the tensions that comes up for people is, does she have to become Jewish on his terms? Yes, because it's a patriarchy. But, or does she get to decide how? Okay, we will be a Jewish household, but, if two Presbyterians get married, they both get to decide what it means to be Presbyterian. If two Catholics get married, Catholicism is big and not particularly ethnically specific. And being Polish Catholic and being Irish Catholic look really, really, really different. You're going to have a negotiation about how it is that you're being Catholic together. Is that different if one person converted?
Gotcha. And so the ethnic thing is super interesting as well because you really explore this multi-ethnic, interracial, interreligious dynamic as well in other chapters. And to me, those parts of the book also offer a snapshot of the future of the U.S. You show Latino, Latina Jewish, African American and Jewish, interfaith white families, among others. So the demographics in this country are speeding up. And learning as much about these topics as we possibly can only benefit, it seems to me, the work that we do together as the population of this country. Do you want to maybe tell me about one of the families in the book that you portray in the 4th chapter and say what you think these portrayals tell us about the future of the country?
The future of the country, I don't know, but I think we're becoming an increasingly religiously and racially diverse country. And I think that, there's a new book that just came out from Beacon Press, and it's called something like When One Religion Isn't Enough.
Yeah, I have it.
I haven't read it yet. I also have it. I've been told that it's not scholarship in the same way. It's memoir, I believe, right?
Yeah.
But it's supposed to be really quite phenomenal. And again, I haven't read it, but it's supposed to be quite phenomenal. And it's, what does it mean to have multiple identities? What does it mean, right, if I tell you that I'm half Indian and on the other side from basically a WASP family with some serious Ashkenazi heritage, so white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, Eastern European Jewish, and I myself am Jewish, but my mother is Unitarian and my father is Hindu. And I grew up celebrating Diwali and Rakhi, which are Hindu holidays. My mom kept Karva Chauth, which is a Hindu holiday. We celebrated Hanukkah as sort of an accessory to Christmas. We celebrated Easter as sort of an accessory to Passover. And we didn't do these things because we were Messianic Jews, and we didn't do these things because we were deep believers in any of them, but we thought that they had important family stories and important rituals and important metaphoric meanings.
Yeah.
Passover is an amazing time to talk about liberation, and Easter is an amazing time to talk about rebirth and starting over and spring. And Diwali is one of the only ways that we intersected with Indian heritage in the family. But I guess the way that I would say it, like sort of from an academic standpoint, is like, the thing is that people's rituals and practices often have traditional theological reference, right? Christmas is the birth of the Savior. Easter is the resurrection. Passover is a very particular story of a very particular chosen people of God's exodus from slavery. Hanukkah is a story about resisting assimilation, sure, but it's also a story about killing assimilators. We don't tell that part routinely in shul, although I think it would be interesting to see what would happen if we did. And Hanukkah is not an important holiday in sort of the Jewish liturgical year, for all it can be an immensely important holiday for families with children who are watching their friends celebrate Christmas. So you can say Hanukkah is not an important Jewish holiday. That's not really the lived experience of lots of American Jews. I mean, or it doesn't have to be, right? And so, like, meanings of change. And one of the things that a lot of people do, and interfaith families do this, but so do other people, right? So people reinscribe new meanings into their holidays and into their rituals. And interfaith families do that all the time, but, like, that's exactly what all Jews who make a fuss about Hanukkah are doing with Hanukkah. They're not talking about killing assimilationist types, and they are talking about, like, light and darkness.
Yeah.
That is what every single liberal Christian who does not want to talk in great and excruciating detail about the Passion of the Christ is doing with Easter, right? They're talking about rebirth and rejuvenation, and, you know, they're saying things like, it doesn't matter whether the resurrection was literal and physical, it is a metaphoric resurrection that is available to all of us. And so, like, interfaith families are changing the meanings, but so are other people.
It's changed a ton since the 1960s, too, with all those things that we talked about earlier with, like, Vatican II in 1966 with the Army Chaplains. So what have been the biggest changes from the 60s until today?
So the 1950s were the decade in 20th century American religion that had the highest rates of religious observance of any decade in the 20th century. So this is a different, and it's been on a pretty steady decline since the 1960s overall. So I think you've got an increase in categories like the religious nuns, N-O-N-E-S, although it turns out that there is a really fantastic group of nuns and nuns that, like, do things together, or at least have an internet presence together, and apparently a penchant for puns.
Nice.
And, you know, the religious nuns are a sticky category because it's like sort of everybody who checks nun on a survey box, but you can't tell very much about what they mean by it. And there are people who do there's scholarship that suggests that they fall into a range of categories, including people who would love to go to church but can't find ones that fit, and people who are sort of religious seekers and believe in like the truth of all of the religions, and then people who are hardcore scientists who think the entire thing is hogwash, and like, you know, all sorts of things like that. But you get those changes. You know, and again, we're an increasingly ethnically diverse country. And so I think you also see increasing combinations. I just read a study that said that in the next generation, they think that 20% of the Jewish population will be people of color. In our imagination, Jews are Eastern European Jews. That's 1 out of 5 Jews is not like Eastern European in origin in the United States. And like, where are those people coming from? Some of them are absolutely people of color who are Jewish and born to people of color Jewish parents. Some of them are people adopted into Ashkenazi Jewish families. Some of them are children of interfaith marriage in which one parent is an Ashkenazi Jew and one parent is not an Ashkenazi Jew. Maybe they are also a Jew of color, and maybe they are, you know, African American or Latinx or Asian, like the people in that chapter I've got. Maybe they're converts. All of those are possible, right? But that's a really different world. And you see that change, you know, Catholicism is increasingly made up of people of color for a wide array of reasons. And evangelical Protestantism is increasingly brown and black. Right. And there are lots of demographic reasons that go into those things. And I'm not a demographer, but it is a changing world.
What are some of the directions that you could see the research going in the next several years? Like as far as like groups?
Like who will be studied?
Yeah. Like, are there any like future studies that you have in mind for yourself? Like I noticed that you mentioned LGBTQ couples or believer, non-believer couples. Like where do you see yourself taking some of the future research?
So I am less interested personally in believer, non-believer couples because I'm more interested in practice and tradition. Although I can imagine like thinking about how do people communicate across gaps in worldview could be very interesting. So I am working on an article with a colleague of mine named Brett Crutch, and it's going to be a comparison of interfaith families and kind of gay rights in terms of Jewish institutional responses to the two. And part of what we are going to ask is synagogues have put a lot more effort and have changed their attitude towards gay rights, LGBTQ rights and persons far more than they have towards interfaith families, where in a lot of ways the institutional synagogue response, there are small tweaks, but it's been pretty stable. Like there's more outreach, but sort of the same message about what they would like and how they understand the problem and that it is a problem. And yet synagogues are much more comfortable spaces, usually for interfaith families than for queer individuals.
Gotcha.
We're writing about that.
Cool.
But my next project is actually called God Bless the Pill, and it's a story of contraception in Tri-Faith America.
Oh, nice.
So I'm thinking about Protestant, Jewish, and Catholic interactions, often around access to the pill, increasing it, limiting it, arguing about it, thinking about how and why religious liberals end up bowing out of that conversation in favor of like secular religious voices and how that came to be.
That sounds awesome. So my last sort of like question for you is a fun one. I have a young child, and there's probably a lot of parents out there listening. Yeah, she was on camera earlier. Can you recommend some of your favorite interfaith children's books for me in the audience? Because I know that you came across quite a few during the research process. Oh, man, I don't really like any of them. Okay.
So for like a young adult book, I like the Mozart season a lot. The Mozart season is about a girl named Allegra whose father is Jewish, and she's got a not Jewish at all mother. That's how she describes her mother. Her mother is, one assumes, a lapsed Catholic or post-Protestant or something like that. She's from Kansas. And she talks a lot about being half Jewish and half not in the book. But you get the sense that she's in this supportive community, and she's got the book has a strong moral story arc. She's a good person. She's concerned with big questions. And she feels badly for her grandmother, who really wants her to be Jewish, and she just doesn't feel like she is a Jewish girl in the way her grandmother wants her to be, but she has sympathy for that point of view on her grandmother's part. So that one is good. There's a book called By Basmati Bat Mitzvah that is fun, that is about a girl whose mother is Indian and has converted to Judaism, and her father is an Ashkenazi Jew. And that one is fun. Again, it's young adult. There have been a few PJ Library books, and when I say I don't like any of them, what I really mean is that they all have really clear agendas.
Oh, gotcha.
And so, there's the Queen of the Hanukkah Dosas is about a Jewish family with an South Indian mom and a South Indian grandma and they make dosas for Hanukkah, and it's a cute story, and it's just sort of like, here is a diverse way of being Jewish, right? But it's not like talking about Hinduism in the family, or I suppose potentially Christianity, or maybe Islam. I'm just thinking about what groups speak the language that they're using. There's a book called My Two Grandmothers that is really nice for families doing both. It's by, there are a couple of books called My Two Grandmothers, but this one is about Grammy Lane and Bubby Silver, and a kid who spends time with Grammy Lane on her farm in a place that looks an awful lot like Kansas. And Granny Silver in the city, and how much she loves both of them, and how she wants to share her traditions with both of them, but how she's sad that Grammy Lane never gets to have latkes and Bubby Silver never gets to have a Christmas tree or whatever. And so it ends up just being food. The Christmas tree never shows up, but she has a special day where each of her grandmothers brings a traditional food, and they share food together and complement each other, and it's very nice. If you're talking about a family that is being Jewish, there's a book called Papa Jethro, in which a kid who is Jewish tells his grandfather, or talks to her grandfather about being Jewish and teaches him about being Jewish, and he teaches her the story of Moses' kid, who Moses had an interfaith marriage, and so Papa Jethro is Moses' father-in-law. So it's a story about a biblical interfaith marriage and how the Jewish kid loves Papa Jethro, the midnight grandfather. So it depends on what you're looking for,
sure,
right, in terms of your children's book. I can't think of any about a family that is Christian. I can think of things about people who are doing both, and people where there is an acknowledgement that the Jewish child has other relatives.
Yeah.
Isn't one that acknowledges that a Christian child has Jewish relatives.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, Dr. Samira Mehta, I have really enjoyed our conversation today. This is such a cool book. I read it on a flight from Buffalo to New York to Charlotte, North Carolina to Little Rock, Arkansas, and then from Little Rock, Arkansas to Chicago, Illinois, and back to Buffalo, New York. So you were with me on this entire trip around the country, and I found myself so just sucked into the stories that you were presenting. It's just such a cool piece of scholarship, and I really do appreciate your time today to talk to me about it. So thank you so much for coming on Classical Ideas. Is there a place where people can find you if they want to maybe follow some of your work and updates?
I have a website. It's just my name. So it's samiramehta.com. On Twitter, I am at Samira, Samira _K_MEHTA. Those are probably the best places to find me.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Classical Ideas is produced by me, Greg Soden. Music on Classical Ideas is composed and performed by Derek Strybig. You can find his music at www.wearewarmmusic.com. If you like this show, please rate it on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can email me at classicalideas@outlook.com or find me on Patreon at patreon.com/classicalideaspodcast. Thanks so much for listening.